I mean, does it seem like there could be some sort of deal? Could the deal be returned to in the near future? Does it look like that, or is it still too opaque?
It is opaque. I think it's possible. I mean, if we had done the interview a week ago, I would say very unlikely. But it seems there has been movement in the last 48 hours. But it really actually depends on which reporter, which publication, which source they're relying on, because you could see very different headlines from all the mainstream publications right now about whether they think a deal is likely. Other things to look at are, for instance, what the investors are doing. I mean, obviously the price of oil has dropped in the last couple of days. I think that's on anticipation of a potential deal, which would mean more oil supply coming into the market, vested interest in a stalemate. So I think there's a lot of conflicting information. Obviously, when the EU put out its version of the deal, and we should really have to go through the whole history of the deal to really understand it, they said this is the final version. But Iran said, without accepting it or rejecting it, that they had certain concerns. They said these current concerns need to be addressed. And it seems, I mean, to me, all the concerns they put out are obviously quite reasonable. So you would think that this would not be a deal breaker. And in fact, Mohammed Morandi, who's actually been on the show or on Breakthrough several times, who's functioning as an advisor to the negotiating team of Iran, he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that he thinks they should be easily resolved. So I think there are sort of glimmers of hope of a potential return to the deal, but there's a lot of interests who are opposed to such a deal, and there's a lot of obstacles still in the way, and there's a lot of history. And that history, people really have to understand. It's not that Iran is being obstinate or whatever it is. Like the Wall Street Journal headline is Iran balks at the finish line. And the whole way in which these phrases and headlines are constructed, you would think that Iran is just run by crazy hardliners who don't want to do anything because the U.S. is the great Satan and so forth. But as if there's no justification to be extremely wary of such a deal, especially given that we are 2 years from the next presidential election. And if Biden gets back into the deal, Trump could do the exact same thing he did if he were to win in 2024 and exit the deal. So you have to say that this is a reasonable concern for a country the size of Iran to think, well, what if we make all sorts of concessions and again the rug is pulled from underneath our feet 2 years or 3 years from now?
Yeah, it is funny the use of the term hardliner, which is a term that the West uses to the Iranians don't call themselves hardliners. But you can
Mike
easily
Pompeo,
say this.
Ultimate hardliner, John Bolton, hardliner. I mean,
Yeah.
Anyway, I totally agree with you.
No, it is the word itself. It's like, you're right. Why isn't that ever applied to the U.S., which actually, like you mentioned, ripped up the deal? And I mean, that's been one of Iran's greatest points of contention here, which is totally legitimate, is the Biden administration has repeatedly told them, we can't guarantee that the next administration won't rip up this deal. So why on earth, why would anybody in their right mind in that situation get back into a deal where the person in charge of it is saying we could just easily violate it and rip it up and say it doesn't matter? The Europeans are quite desperate right now, right? Like that's a part of the reason why you mentioned oil prices. That's a part of the reason why there is optimism this deal might go through, because the Europeans are like begging the Americans, please let us return to this deal because we need other energy to rely on. Can you talk a bit about, the way that the war in Ukraine and the desperate energy needs of the Europeans are connected to the revival of this deal?
Yeah, I think the big storyline of the Ukraine war, when you think about it, is how Western Europe has prostrated itself and subordinated itself entirely to U.S. interests at its own expense. I mean, energy is going to be rationed, or already is in the process of being rationed in major countries in Western Europe. The fall and winter are coming, as the Iranian negotiators are very coyly putting out on Twitter. Things are going to get cold soon. They actually have like a deadline where they have to make some deal to bring some new energy supplies into their market. And, Germany, France, by canceling the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, by decoupling in all these tremendous ways, they are obviously going to hurt the living standards of their own people, hurt businesses, corporations, industrialists, sorts of things in the Western European economy are going to be affected if there's not a rapid conclusion to the Ukraine war. And it makes them more and more desperate for new oil to come into the market from Iran. Now, the big storyline, when you go back even further, is how Europe also subordinated itself when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. There is this sector of of the militarist, the most aggressive, the foreign policy establishment, the core of it, that seems to not quite still understand this. And they still think that you can just basically put maximum pressure on Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, all these countries that are very resource rich, and there's going to be nothing that happens. But if you look at the fallout of the Iraq War, I'll just say this. Iran was a major beneficiary in a sort of regional political sense of the Iraq War, because Iraq as a country could only be stabilized with the assistance of Iran, or with Iran playing a bigger role in Iraqi politics. The U.S. took out the Afghan government and the Iraqi government, on both sides of Iran. Iran, therefore, in a way, becomes stronger within the region. And then we wag our finger at Iran and say, Iran is getting stronger in the region. How dare it get stronger in the region?
The word you're thinking of is malign influence.
Yes, the malign influence. And so there's something kind of ridiculous in that the U.S. policies never seem to register as like, oh, there's actually fallout and consequences for all of these things. So yes, Iran's influence has grown in the region. And I think we have to try to identify what is the underlying contradiction here. Because from an economic standpoint, you want stability. I mean, that's what Goldman Sachs and the others that I started off talking about. They want stability. If you look at, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz, which we might have a map of, I hope we do. But the Strait of Hormuz, which the Iranian naval forces essentially control.
There we go.
Okay, this little area here. I mean, this is where 1/3 of the liquefied natural gas of the world comes through. And I think it's like 1/6 or 1/7 of the oil goes through this little strait of water that the Iranian military essentially could shut down if it wanted to. It would be a world historic event that would change the economy, change politics, change the world, perhaps trigger major military conflicts. So that hasn't happened yet. But this is not like a little country that you can just bully forever and think that nothing's going to happen. This country actually can impact global trade beyond just their own oil reserves, just based on its coasts. So you have this contradiction where, on one hand, capitalism needs stability. But if you have a stable world order, you also have these countries which are big, have big populations, militaries, economies. They'll be able to rise within that world order and therefore challenge the United States. So how can you actually create a stable, like if you step back from it, how can you create a stable Middle East? Like that's the phrase they always use, that doesn't include Iran, or that doesn't include tens of millions of Shia people in the countries that you named. Of course, they have to have their interests represented. They have to be respected in that. If you actually want a stable Middle East, you have to work with the countries that are actually there. And so on the other hand, you have people who say, if we have a stable, peaceful world, the United States will not be able to survive as the sole hegemon. So therefore, you have an interest in stoking instability, in cutting countries off from one another.
آنچه در مورد ما میگویند